My parents said the inheritance was equal in spirit, not in assets, but a hidden valuation report showed my share had been systematically stripped over decades. I remember sitting at my parents' dining table, staring at a folder I was never supposed to see. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the papers straight. My mother kept saying the same line over and over again like it was supposed to calm me down. "Everything is equal in spirit," she said softly, avoiding my eyes. My father just nodded like that sentence explained everything. But what I was holding told a completely different story. A full valuation breakdown of every asset in our family's name. And next to my name, the numbers didn't just look smaller. They looked systematically reduced over time, like someone had been trimming my share year after year without me ever noticing. I didn't even know this report existed until 2 days before that moment, and now it felt like the key to understanding my entire life was sitting in my lap. I didn't understand how something like this could happen without me realizing, or worse, how long it had been happening right under my nose. I kept thinking there had to be an explanation that didn't involve betrayal. But the more I read, the harder that explanation became to believe. It started with something small, or at least something that seemed small at the time. My cousin mentioned in passing that family assets were being reviewed. She said it casually, like it was just paperwork for taxes, but something about the way she avoided looking at me made me uneasy. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying every conversation I'd ever had about money in our family. My parents always said they treated everything equally. Equal in spirit, not in assets. My father used to repeat like it was a philosophy, not a decision. I used to think it meant fairness in a deeper sense, that we were valued the same even if the distribution wasn't perfectly mathematical. But I never questioned what not in assets actually meant, until I saw the report, until I realized not in assets might have been doing a lot more work than I ever understood. The first page alone made my stomach drop. It listed properties, investments, business shares, and trusts. Our family wasn't wealthy in a flashy way, but we had accumulated a lot over decades. Small businesses, rental properties, farmland, and long-term investments. The kind of wealth that doesn't look dramatic until it's broken down line by line. My older brother's name appeared everywhere. My sister's name too, and mine was there as well, but the proportions didn't make sense, not just slightly unequal, consistently reduced in ways that followed a pattern. Every time a new asset was added, my share seemed to lag behind. Every time something was reallocated, I lost a percentage, not all at once, not in a way that would be obvious, but slowly, almost politely, like someone was making sure I wouldn't notice. I remember flipping through the pages faster and faster, looking for a moment where it would correct itself, where my share would suddenly match my siblings. But it never did. Instead, it got worse the further back I went. Older records showed I once had equal footing, then something shifted when I was around 14. That was the year my father started talking about family stability more often. At the time, I thought it was just stress from expanding their business. Now I wasn't so sure. I asked my mother where the report came from. She said it was part of a long-overdue consolidation review. Her tone was careful, like she had rehearsed it. My father added that everything had been handled transparently, but neither of them could look at me directly. That was the first crack I noticed in their confidence. Not anger, not defensiveness. Avoidance. Like they were trying to hold a story together that was starting to slip. I told them I didn't understand how my share could be this low. My voice came out sharper than I expected. My father sighed like he was tired of explaining something I should already understand. "It's not about equal numbers," he said. "It's about who the assets were built for." That sentence hit harder than anything else, because it sounded like I wasn't included in that definition. I asked him what he meant by that. He hesitated for a long time before answering. Then he said something that made my chest tighten. "You left the house earlier than your siblings. You chose a different path." Like that explained everything. Like leaving for university meant forfeiting decades of family accumulation. I remembered working part-time through college because I didn't want to burden them. I remembered turning down help because I thought it was fairer that way. I remembered being told I was independent like it was a compliment. Now it felt like it had been quietly converted into justification. That night I went home and started digging through my own records. Old emails, bank statements, family agreements I barely remembered signing. At first I thought I was just missing context. But then I noticed something strange. Certain expenses I had paid into the family system weren't reflected anywhere as contributions. Maintenance costs for the old family house. Emergency funds for my father's medical bills years ago. Even contributions I made during early business struggles. They were acknowledged at the time as support, but not counted as equity. Only my siblings' contributions were tied to ownership percentages. I felt like I was looking at my own life from the outside. Every sacrifice I thought was shared suddenly felt one-sided. Every "we appreciate your help" now sounded like a receipt without value. And the worst part was how normal it all looked when isolated. Nothing screamed fraud or manipulation. It was all just interpretation, framing, structure, language, and that made it harder to fight. A few days later, I confronted my older brother first. He acted surprised but not shocked. That bothered me more than anything. He told me he didn't handle the finances, that everything came from my parents' decisions. But then he added something casually that stayed with me. "Honestly, I thought you knew your portion was always going to be smaller." I asked him why he thought that. He shrugged and said, "You were never around for the long-term planning meetings." Long-term planning meetings, something I didn't even know existed, something I was never invited to. That was the moment I started realizing this wasn't accidental. It wasn't just oversight or misunderstanding. It was structured exclusion, but I still couldn't understand why. I kept thinking there had to be a logical reason that didn't involve intentional harm. Maybe trust issues, maybe tradition, maybe some cultural assumption I wasn't aware of. So I went back to my parents. This time I didn't bring anger. I brought questions. I asked them about the planning meetings. My father went quiet immediately. My mother looked surprised, then uncomfortable. She said those meetings were just informal discussions. But my brother's words didn't match that. Nothing matched anymore. I asked why I was excluded, and my father finally said something different. "You were the one who didn't want to be involved." I froze because that wasn't true, at least not in the way he meant it. I remembered being told I was too focused on my own career to attend certain family discussions. I remembered being reassured that it wasn't important for me. Now it sounded like those moments had been reframed into my decision. I left their house that night feeling like I was losing grip on my own history. Every memory started feeling unstable. Every conversation potentially reinterpreted. Every absence of information now suspicious. And the valuation report was still sitting in my bag like a weight I couldn't put down. A week later, I took it to an independent financial analyst. I didn't tell my family. I just needed clarity. I needed someone outside the system to look at it. The analyst spent almost an hour going through it silently. Then he asked me a question that changed everything. "Do you know why your share dips every time a new asset is acquired?" I said no. He turned the report around and pointed at a pattern I hadn't fully understood. He said my portion wasn't just reduced. It was being used as a balancing mechanism. Whenever the family needed liquidity or leverage, my share absorbed the adjustment. Not randomly, not equally, but repeatedly, like a buffer. I felt my throat tighten. He explained it in simple terms. When new assets were added instead of redistributing evenly, my portion was used to stabilize ratios between my siblings and the core family line. I asked him if that was normal. He hesitated before saying, "It's not illegal, but it is intentional." Intentional. That word echoed in my head all the way home, because it meant someone made choices, repeatedly. Over years, that night I couldn't stop thinking about one thing. Why me? Not in an emotional sense, in a structural one. Why was I the buffer? Why was I the adjustment variable? What made me the flexible piece in a system that otherwise stayed rigid? When I confronted my parents again, I brought the analyst's summary. My mother immediately became defensive. She said financial structures in families are always complicated. My father said it was about preserving continuity. But neither of them denied the pattern anymore. That was the shift I didn't expect. Not denial, just justification. I asked them directly why I was the one absorbing the adjustments. My father finally said something I wasn't prepared for. "You were the least dependent on it." I laughed before I could stop myself, because it sounded absurd. But he wasn't joking, he continued. "You built your own career, you had your own income. Your siblings relied on family capital more directly." My mother added quietly, "We thought you would be fine." That was the moment everything clicked in a way that made me feel sick. It wasn't about punishment, it wasn't about dislike, it was about assumption. They had quietly categorized me as the one who could absorb loss, the one who wouldn't collapse under it, the one who would adapt, and somehow that had justified everything. But what hurt more was what came next. My mother said almost gently, "We still treated you equally in spirit." Like that sentence could repair decades of imbalance. I stared at her for a long time, and I realized something I hadn't admitted yet. They didn't think they had taken anything from me, because in their minds I could afford it. The realization didn't make me angry immediately. It made me quiet, because anger requires clarity. And I was still processing how something so systematic could have been so invisible. Over the next few weeks, I stopped attending family gatherings, not dramatically, just gradually. Messages went unanswered longer, calls were missed. At first, my family thought I just needed space. My sister tried to reassure me that nothing had really changed. But that was exactly the problem. Nothing had changed because they believed nothing was wrong. Then came the final conversation. My father asked me if I wanted them to rebalance things now, like it was a spreadsheet correction, like decades could be adjusted with a new line item. I asked him if that would include restoring what had already been reallocated. He said that wasn't really possible, because some of it had already been absorbed into structure. That phrase again, structure. I realized then that this wasn't a mistake they were correcting. It was a system they believed was fair. I told them I needed time, but what I really meant was distance. Now I look back at every moment differently. Every time I was told I was independent. Every time I was excluded for convenience. Every time my contributions were praised but not counted. It wasn't random. It was consistent. And the hardest truth is that no one in my family sees it as betrayal. They see it as practicality, as balance, as survival of a structure they believe is fair. But I can't unsee the pattern anymore. I can't go back to believing I was treated equally just because the intention felt kind. Because now I understand something I wish I didn't. Sometimes people don't take from you in obvious ways. Sometimes they just decide over years that you can afford to lose more than others, and call it fairness because it kept the system stable.